Beneath the surface of every war lies a silence more dangerous than the clash of armies. A silence crafted from vanished records, locked vaults, and whispers that bleed through classified pages. Imagine a world where convoys never arrive, where sealed crates change hands under cover of smoke, and where entire histories dissolve into shadows before they are written. The maps we study show borders and battles, yet they conceal darker contours, where decisions were etched in ink that could never see daylight. Behind the official reports, another war was fought, one without medals, one where knowledge itself was contraband. To enter those corridors is to step where light has been forbidden, where archives breathe with secrets long suppressed, and where every missing page hints at a truth too corrosive for the victors to reveal. Listen carefully, because what lingers in the silence of history is often louder than what survived in its books. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Convoy of Murmansk. In the freezing waters of the Barents Sea, Convoy PQ-17 set sail in June 1942, a desperate lifeline to the Soviet Union. 35 merchant vessels carried tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies critical to Stalin's front, guarded by a screen of destroyers, corvettes, and a distant covering force of cruisers and battleships. On paper, the mission was routine. Run the gauntlet of German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, endure the Arctic storms, and deliver material to Murmansk. What followed instead was one of the most catastrophic and mysterious episodes in Allied convoy history. Official histories blame poor communication between the Admiralty in London and the escort commanders at sea. Yet documents unearthed in 1975 from the Naval Historical Branch suggest another layer. Files labelled Seawolf point to a coordinated, unsanctioned operation by German U-boat command, one that may have intercepted not only ships, but the convoy's true cargo. The turning point came on 4th July 1942. Acting on reports that the battleship Tirpitz had sortied from Trondheim, First Sea Lord Dudley Pound ordered the convoy to scatter. The escorts pulled away, leaving the merchantmen exposed across the Barents. Tirpitz never engaged them, but German aircraft and U-boats descended, sinking 24 of the 35 ships. Among those lost was the SS Navarino, officially recorded as destroyed by torpedo fire, with all hands lost. Yet decrypted Enigma intercepts recovered after the war tell a different story. A Kriegsmarine message dated 6 July referred cryptically to special cargo, secured, and transfer under Seawolf procedure. No Allied report ever mentioned recovery. Attempts or survivors from Navarino crewmen, who survived other sinkings, later testified to phantom signals broadcast during the chaos. One Royal Navy signalman aboard HMS Keppel described receiving coded instructions in perfect English ordering merchant ships to divert north by northeast, bearing frequencies not consistent with any Allied command station. Another recalled seeing Navarino break from formation hours before she was reported destroyed, steaming toward an isolated rendezvous point. These accounts were dismissed as confusion under fire, yet when cross-referenced with post-war German naval diaries, the possibility emerges that Navarino was boarded rather than sunk, her hold seized and crew silenced. Why Navarino? Cargo manifests held in the Admiralty archives show she carried not only tanks and trucks, but special consignment crates under diplomatic seal. Markings included reference codes tied to British radar laboratories and communications intelligence units. The Soviets, expecting delivery, lodged furious complaints after the convoy's losses. But Moscow's files contain no record of ever receiving such materials. Some historians speculate these crates contained experimental centimetric radar arrays, vital for countering U-boat wolf packs. Others suggest encryption equipment intended to strengthen Soviet cipher systems. Both theories would have made Navarino an attractive prize for German intelligence. By late July 1942, fragments of wreckage identified as Navarino washed ashore on Novaya Zemlya, but no human remains were recovered. This was unusual in Arctic sinkings, where bodies often surfaced weeks later. A Norwegian fisherman's diary recovered decades later in Tromsø recorded seeing a ship towed under escort by U-boats in those same waters on 8th July. His notes describe a freighter without flag, darkened, guarded by two shadows. No naval record corroborates his claim. The Seawolf files add weight to these anomalies. These documents, released piecemeal from the Bundesarchiv, include references to a detachment of U-boats operating independently from normal command structures in mid-1942. Designated Gruppe Seawolf, they were tasked with special recovery operations, rather than standard convoy interdiction. The files contain coordinates aligning with PQ-17's route and mention a valuable acquisition delivered to Narvik before being forwarded to Kiel. From there, the trail vanishes into gaps marked classified until 2045. Allied intelligence officers who revisited the case in the Cold War years came away disturbed. A 1953 CIA memorandum, declassified in 1999, refers obliquely to missing cargo possibly integrated into Soviet collection efforts. Post-1945, this suggests American suspicion that the Germans may have transferred whatever was taken to the Soviets, either as a bargaining chip during the chaotic final days of the war or through capture by advancing Red Army units in 1945. British files, however, point in another direction. An internal Admiralty memo from 1962 speculates that elements of Navarino's cargo may have been absorbed into NATO research itself, smuggled back west after the war under intelligence agreements too sensitive to acknowledge publicly. The families of Navarino's crew never received conclusive answers. Inquiries were met with the standard explanation: the ship was torpedoed, lost with all hands, nothing more could be done. Yet one peculiar case surfaced in 1948, when a British naval officer reported encountering a gaunt, half-mad man in a displaced persons camp outside Lübeck, who claimed to have been a stoker aboard Navarino. The man vanished before he could be properly questioned, and no record of his identity remains. Some believe he was silenced, others that his mind was broken by captivity. Convoy PQ-17 remains a byword for disaster in naval history. But beneath the accepted narrative lurks a darker suggestion. The scattered merchantmen may have been not merely victims of poor strategy, but pawns in a shadow operation where certain ships were deliberately exposed. The decision to scatter, while explained by the Tirpitz threat, coincided with radio anomalies and conflicting orders. Did the Admiralty know more than it admitted? Was Navarino's sacrifice to conceal the transfer of technology not meant for Soviet hands? Or was she intercepted by a German detachment operating under directives unknown even to Dönitz himself? To this day, no conclusive wreck of Navarino has been identified in the Barents. Modern sonar expeditions claim to have located her remains in 2014, but inconsistencies in hull markings suggest the wreck may belong to another freighter. The Vanishing convoy continues to live up to its name. What little we know comes from scattered documents, testimonies smudged by time, and whispers in the margins of archives. Convoy PQ-17 was not just a naval disaster, but a black hole in the record, pulling into its silence men, machines, and knowledge that neither victors nor vanquished seem willing to illuminate. The northern seas hold their secrets well. Beneath the shifting ice and crushing depths, perhaps the remains of SS Navarino rest, her holds emptied, her crew erased, her story fragmented into half-truths. Whether seized by the Seawolf detachment, betrayed by signals from within her own fleet, or lost to the abyss in ways history dares not record, her fate embodies the cold calculus of war, where lives and ships are expendable, but secrets endure. For the men who sailed PQ-17, the convoy's mission was simple: to deliver supplies. For the unseen hands moving behind the official orders, the convoy may have been something else entirely, a cover for transfers, diversions, and disappearances that still haunt the frozen silence of the Barents Sea. Chapter 2: Operation Eclipse, Berlin's Hidden Bunkers. Berlin, April 1945. The Reich capital was a city consumed by collapse, its streets reduced to rubble, its citizens trapped between advancing Soviet armies and the last desperate defenders of Hitler's Reich. Official history remembers the Battle of Berlin as a final, bloody siege, yet buried within the archives of the British War Office lies another account, one never meant for public scrutiny. Under the codename Operation Eclipse, units of the British 21st Army Group were tasked not only with occupying German territory, but with securing intelligence assets before they could fall into Soviet hands. Within this wider operation lay a smaller, more secret directive: seize research files, hidden caches, and technical laboratories buried beneath the city's ruins, some of which had never appeared on any official map. The orders were explicit. In late April, as Soviet tanks pushed into the eastern suburbs, British reconnaissance detachments advanced west of the city perimeter, ostensibly to block Wehrmacht units attempting to retreat. Yet their route maps, preserved in faded carbon copies, direct them to specific grid references surrounding the Reich Chancellery and Tiergarten. A Royal Engineers report dated May 1945 notes sealed substructures beneath the Reich complex, partially flooded, likely by deliberate charges. The same report, classified most secret, lists recovered items, fragmented documents bearing the Reichsadler insignia, diagrams annotated Wunderwaffe, and metallic canisters with experimental fuel compounds. No mention of these finds appeared in the combined Chiefs of Staff reports delivered to Washington and London. Instead, references to technical materials of no value obscured the real nature of what had been pulled from the ruins. Testimonies from men present tell a different story. Sergeant Harold Whitcomb, later interviewed under oath for a restricted inquiry, described entering a tunnel beneath Wilhelmstrasse. The walls were scorched. You could see twisted rebar. In one chamber, we found steel cabinets welded shut. Engineers used thermite to breach them. Inside were rolls of blueprints, technical notes in Gothic script, and a box of glass cylinders with liquid that gave off a sharp odor. We were told to load everything immediately. After that, we never saw it again. Soviet officers arriving days later reported only collapsed bunkers and charred remains. Moscow accused the British of removing entire archives before Red Army units reached the Reich Chancellery. Their suspicion was not unfounded. Shipping manifests from RAF bases in occupied Germany reference sealed crates, delivered by Convoy from Berlin in June 1945. The contents are listed merely as technical evaluation, destination undisclosed. Cross-referencing Air Ministry indexes shows the crates bypassed all normal cataloguing procedures. What were these materials? Declassified fragments hint at projects far more advanced than the V-2 rockets already known. One dossier refers to Project Sturmvogel, believed to involve high-altitude propulsion research. Another page, preserved only in partial microfilm, bears the term magnetische Waffen, magnetic weapons. Historians struggle to assess the credibility of these documents, yet the terminology aligns with scattered references in other captured files. The more disquieting discovery, however, lay in recovered testimonies from captured German technicians. 2 prisoners interrogated at Dulag 157 spoke of a central archive sealed beneath the Reichskanzlei garden, protected by SS units who detonated charges to prevent capture. They claimed much of the archive related to nuclear materials research conducted in Thuringia, far from Berlin. Yet why such material would be hidden in the capital's substructures raises unsettling questions. By 1946, Allied intelligence services were already rewriting the story. Publicly, Operation Eclipse was portrayed as a post-surrender occupation plan. Privately, its Berlin component disappeared from official discourse. The last known internal review, held at Whitehall in 1952, was destroyed in a fire, though a single surviving minute records the chairman's remark. Eclipse remains a liability should disclosure occur. In the absence of full records, speculation flourished. Some argued the caches included chemical agents intended for a last-ditch defense of Berlin. Others believed they were prototypes of aircraft propulsion systems years ahead of their time. One peculiar lead came in, the form of blurred photographs found in a private collection auctioned in Munich in 1991. The images show British officers standing beside stacks of crates, each marked with stenciled codes, ECL7, ECL12, ECL19. One photograph captures a schematic pinned to a wall, partially legible, with words Hochfrequenz and Leitstrahl. Experts in wartime electronics believe this suggests work on high-frequency beam guidance, possibly related to advanced radar or missile targeting. The photos were confiscated after the auction by German authorities and never seen again. For Berlin's citizens in 1945, these operations remained invisible. They witnessed only the collapse, the hunger, the burning buildings. Yet behind the curtain of chaos, soldiers and engineers moved through tunnels, cataloguing and seizing what remained of a dying regime's ambitions. One report by Captain Thomas Wilkes describes entering a chamber where SS guards had shot themselves beside crates stacked ceiling high. Among the bodies lay binders filled with handwritten calculations, smeared with blood. The binders were removed, and Wilkes never learned their fate. The Soviets, denied access, responded with their own measures. NKVD files detail attempts to locate alternative caches in the city. They recovered fragments from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, though most sensitive equipment had already been evacuated. In a furious communique to Stalin, Marshal Zhukov accused the British of looting under cover of joint operations. London denied the charge, but privately, Correspondence between Churchill and his chiefs shows awareness that valuable material must be secured at all cost before the Russians. Today, the ruins of Berlin have long since been rebuilt. The tunnels collapsed or buried beneath concrete. Yet whispers persist among archivists and historians. Why do certain wartime projects vanish abruptly from both German and Allied files after May 1945? Why are sections of the War Office catalogue labelled missing, presumed destroyed, always in reference to technical evaluations from Eclipse? The silence is suggestive not of irrelevance, but of concealment. The story of Berlin's hidden bunkers is not one of wonder weapons unleashed, nor of science fiction speculation. It is instead a tale of erasure, of discoveries too dangerous or politically inconvenient to admit. For every page burned or blacked out, fragments remain, an annotation here, a photograph there, hinting at knowledge spirited away under the cover of victory. Operation Eclipse was more than a code name. It was an act of deliberate shadow, ensuring that what lay beneath Berlin in those final weeks would never reach public light. What became of the crates labelled ECL? Were they studied in British laboratories, buried in American archives, or destroyed to prevent proliferation? No record answers. The only certainty is that they existed, documented by men who saw them, photographed them, signed manifests for them, and then, like so many wartime secrets, they disappeared into silence. Berlin's rubble concealed more than corpses and ruin. Beneath the Chancellery Garden, beneath the Tiergarten tunnels, beneath layers of rubble and denial lay a cache of documents and devices that passed from one set of victors to another, only to vanish into locked rooms and burned files. The city that had symbolized the hubris of the Third Reich became, in its final collapse, a vault for secrets that would shape the early shadows of the Cold War. Operation Eclipse was declared complete in June 1945. In truth, its consequences remain unfinished, buried in archives where silence itself testifies louder than words. Chapter 3. The Orphan Files of Camp King. In the wooded hills outside Oberursel, a small German town north of Frankfurt, stood a facility few civilians ever noticed. During the war, it had served the Wehrmacht as a communications school. By 1946, it bore a new name, Camp King. Officially, the United States Army designated it as an interrogation and intelligence center, a place where high-ranking prisoners of war could be questioned before trial or release. Yet from its earliest days in American hands, Camp King evolved into something darker, a node in the emerging shadow war between East and West. Buried in declassified case logs, half-erased testimonies, and cryptic references lies the story of the so-called Orphan Files, documents that surfaced briefly in 1952, before vanishing into silence. The first mention of the Orphan Files appears in an Army counter, Intelligence Corps, CIC inventory list dated 3rd of April, 1952. Among hundreds of folders, catalogued as interrogation reports, a subsection marked ORP1 through ORP23 is recorded. Their contents are described as sensitive testimonies pertaining to escape networks, foreign placement, and special experimentation. 3 weeks later, the index was amended. The ORP designation was gone. By June, when auditors requested the files, they were untraceable. No transfer papers exist. The folders simply disappeared. What might have been in them? A fragment survives in the form of an affidavit signed by Lieutenant Robert F. Hall, CIC officer. In it, Hall recalls one particular prisoner, a former SS officer identified only as Dr. K. According to Hall, Dr. K provided maps of escape routes leading from Bavaria through Italy to South American ports. He also described caches of forged identity papers supplied by sympathetic clerics. Most disturbingly, Hall mentions Dr. K speaking of a psychological trial program in which detainees were subjected to sensory deprivation and chemical injections. Hall's affidavit notes that these references were logged under ORP 7, later struck from the record. The connection between these testimonies and later CIA programs is difficult to ignore. By 1950, the United States had already initiated Project Bluebird, an early effort to explore methods of controlling or breaking the human mind. Camp King appears in scattered CIA documents from this period, often disguised under innocuous code words. A memorandum dated November 1950 lists Camp King among forward testing sites, though without elaboration. Another, preserved only as a carbon copy, refers to transfer of assets from ORP 12 to Bluebird channels. Whether this refers to personnel, data, or prisoners remains unclear. German intelligence services, too, had a stake in the camp. By 1949, West Germany was rebuilding under Allied oversight. Former Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst officers, some implicated in atrocities, found themselves curiously shielded from prosecution if they agreed to cooperate against the Soviets. Camp King became a holding ground where their pasts could be sanitized. Prisoner rosters from 1947 list names later absent from denazification hearings, individuals who instead reappeared in West German security agencies or disappeared altogether. The Orphan files may well have contained the paper trail of these erased lives, explaining why they could never be allowed into the open. Testimonies from locals add unsettling texture. Residents of Oberursel recalled trucks arriving at the camp at night, their windows blacked out. One former cook claimed she was instructed never to speak of prisoners kept in isolated cells, men who were transferred in secrecy and whose names were never written on rosters. A neighbor living near the camp's perimeter fence reported hearing agonized cries in the early mornings, followed by silence. These accounts, dismissed at the time, resonate with later revelations of human experimentation conducted in CIA custody during the early Cold War. In 1979, a Freedom of Information request accidentally revealed a reference to ORP files in a Department of Defense index. The entry, partially redacted, described archived case notes from Oberursel facility pertaining to special subjects. Within weeks, the entry was removed from subsequent versions of the index. When pressed, the Pentagon stated the files were misfiled references, non-existent in substance. Yet, one surviving memorandum from the same period records a CIA request for Orphan transcription review, suggesting at least some materials were still in circulation. The fate of the Orphan files has since become a matter of speculation. Some argue they were destroyed to protect the identities of Nazi officers who were repurposed as intelligence assets. Others believe the files contained records of early behavioral experiments that, if disclosed, would have implicated American officials in practices resembling those later condemned at Nuremberg. A few more conspiratorial voices suggest the files included evidence of a transnational escape apparatus, the so-called rat lines, showing not only Vatican complicity, but also tacit Allied approval in certain cases. The label Orphan itself raises questions. Were these files considered orphans because they belonged to no official program existing outside legal frameworks? Or did the name reflect the status of their subjects, men abandoned by their state, stripped of allegiance, useful only as instruments in another war? Whatever its meaning, the codename appears repeatedly in fragments, always in connection with files never seen in full. By the 1980s, when former Camp King personnel began speaking publicly, hints resurfaced. One retired officer, requesting anonymity, told a German journalist, "There were records in 1952 that disappeared in the night. We called them the Orphans because no one claimed them, but everyone wanted them. They went upward, not downward." Asked what was in them, he replied only, "Names, experiments, and roots. Enough to bury us all." The grounds of Camp King today are unremarkable. The site was decommissioned in the 1990s, its barracks converted into apartments, its interrogation cells filled in with concrete. Yet beneath the manicured lawns and residential streets, foundations remain where walls once echoed with voices never meant to be heard. For archivists and historians, the disappearance of the Orphan files represents more than a missing folder. It is a void in the official record, a deliberate excision at the very moment when the transition from one world war to another kind of war was taking shape. Some fragments persist, blacked-out pages that nevertheless reveal coordinates to erased airfields in Bavaria. A stray photograph of a filing cabinet stenciled with ORP-14, a scribbled notation in an intelligence officer's diary, transfer of K completed, Orphan secured. Each piece is like a torn scrap of a larger map, impossible to reassemble yet undeniable in its suggestion of something once whole. The silence surrounding the Orphan files may never be broken. If they exist, they remain sealed in vaults where disclosure would unravel carefully maintained narratives of justice, alliance, and post-war reconstruction. If they were destroyed, then the destruction itself becomes testimony, a recognition that what they contained was too dangerous for history to hold. Camp King's legacy is thus not only as a site of interrogation, but as a place where truth was deliberately unrecorded, where men and memories were made into orphans by design. Chapter 4. The Arctic Base. Known as Haudegen, on Nordaustlandet, a barren expanse of permafrost and jagged cliffs within the Svalbard archipelago. A small German detachment continued to operate long after Hitler's Reich had collapsed. Known as Weather Station Haudegen, this unit of 11 men was established in September 1944 to transmit meteorological data vital to the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe. Yet the official explanation that they were merely forecasters monitoring Arctic storms fails to align with fragments of intelligence records and cryptic transmissions intercepted in 1945. What remains is the story of a base that outlived the war it served, its transmissions carrying codes that no victor would later acknowledge. The station's existence was confirmed when U-307, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Georg Herle, delivered the team and their equipment to Nordostlandet. The mission logs describe the unloading of crates labeled not only with weather instruments, but also with radio components and sealed containers. Once ashore, the men erected prefabricated huts and a 10-meter radio mast. Their orders were simple: send encrypted weather reports at scheduled intervals to Naval Command in Tromsø. Yet decrypted Allied intercepts reveal anomalies. A series of transmissions from January to April 1945 contained irregular bursts inconsistent with weather coding, flagged by Bletchley Park analysts as possible one-time pad traffic. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the Arctic outpost received no formal surrender order. Its crew continued transmissions through the summer, apparently convinced or instructed that the war still continued. Allied naval patrols in the region never attempted to directly assault the base. Declassified Norwegian Navy files suggest this was intentional. A memorandum dated August 1945 notes, Haudegen maintains transmissions beyond surrender. Pattern indicates coordination with submerged assets. Orders are to observe only. The term submerged assets almost certainly referred to U-boats. Indeed, German naval diaries recovered after the war reference. Attempts by isolated submarines to rendezvous near Svalbard as late as July 1945. The station finally surrendered on 4 September 1945, 4 months after Germany's capitulation. Norwegian sealers reached the camp by vessel, where they found the men in surprisingly good condition. The surrender was uneventful. The Germans handed over their rifles and were later transported to Tromsø. Their equipment, however, did not accompany them. Norwegian naval officers immediately sealed the transmitters and antenna arrays, placing them under armed guard until they could be shipped south. Officially, these were described as radio weather equipment. Yet shipping manifests list additional crates under restricted designations. Their fate is unknown. They never reached Oslo's archives. The content of Haudegen's transmissions has long been debated. Some argue the anomalies were merely errors caused by Arctic interference. Others point to evidence suggesting the station doubled as a relay point in a wider communication chain. Allied intercept logs record at least 7 instances where U-boat signals appeared to route through Nordostlandet before bouncing south. If true, this would mean Haudegen was not merely transmitting weather updates, but functioning as a clandestine node for residual naval operations after Germany's defeat. Survivors of the Haudegen detachment gave inconsistent testimonies. During interrogations in 1946, their commanding officer, Wilhelm Deger, insisted they had been isolated and unaware of the Reich's fall until their capture. Yet in a private letter to his family years later, Deger admitted receiving confusing orders in May 1945, instructing the station to continue transmissions for collection, regardless of political situation. Another member of the team, interviewed in 1960, cryptically remarked, "We were not abandoned. Someone was still listening." Further, complicating the story are accounts of sealed cylinders discovered near the station in the 1950s. Norwegian scientists conducting geological surveys reported finding rusted canisters embedded in permafrost, some containing degraded film reels. The reels were quickly confiscated by military authorities. One witness claimed to have glimpsed images of polar charts marked with navigation routes, though this remains unverified. Subsequent searches failed to recover additional evidence. Haudegen's significance may lie not in what it achieved, but in what it symbolized. The persistence of a war apparatus unwilling to surrender. The Kriegsmarine had long valued weather stations for their strategic role in submarine operations. Control of meteorological data meant control of convoys, predicting storms that could shelter wolf packs or hinder Allied patrols. But if Haudegen also transmitted encoded traffic, then its endurance into late 1945 served another purpose: maintaining a lifeline for scattered remnants of the U-boat fleet, or possibly relaying sensitive data toward destinations never revealed. Allied treatment of the station's capture remains telling. While the men were quietly repatriated, their files were sealed. A British Foreign Office memo from October 1945 notes, "Details of Nordaustlandet station to remain restricted. Disclosure undesirable." Even decades later, when most wartime files were declassified, references to Haudegen remain curiously absent. The silence suggests not insignificance, but a subject deemed too inconvenient to address publicly. By the late 20th century, historians attempting to reconstruct the station's history found themselves confronting gaps. Archives in London, Washington, and Oslo contained passing references, but no full records. Anecdotes from naval intelligence veterans describe boxes of Arctic files lost in transit or misplaced during cataloguing. What survived were fragments, intercepted signal transcripts, weather logs, and scattered personal accounts. Each points towards something beyond meteorology, yet never enough to prove it. Today, the remains of Haudegen still stand, rusting in the polar cold. The huts and antenna bases endure as silent witnesses, visited occasionally by researchers or tourists. Few who step into the decaying structures know the ambiguity surrounding them. They see only relics of an isolated weather station, unaware that the airwaves it once carried may have borne far more than barometric readings. The Arctic preserves its secrets as surely as it preserves the bones of men and machines lost to ice. Whether Haudegen was a forgotten outpost of a defeated Reich or an active relay for shadow operations, its story sits in the twilight between confirmed fact and suppressed truth. The station's crew were treated as an odd historical footnote, the last Germans to surrender. Yet in the missing crates, the intercepted anomalies, and the silence of Allied files, one perceives a deeper significance, that the war's end was not as clean as we are told. In the Arctic night, Haudegen transmitted signals into the ether, and someone, somewhere, was listening. Chapter 5. Shadows of Operation Paperclip's Black Wing. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allies raced not only for territory but for knowledge. Out of the ashes of the Reich's research programs came Operation Paperclip, the clandestine effort by the United States to extract German scientists and place them into American service. Official histories emphasize the aerospace breakthroughs, Werner von Braun, the V-2 rockets, the seeds of NASA. Yet among the blacked-out pages and restricted dossiers lies evidence of a lesser-known branch, never formally acknowledged, that intelligence officers themselves referred to as the Black Wing. Unlike the celebrated engineers, this cadre was drawn from the shadows of the Reich's most secret programs: chemical warfare, psychological conditioning, and interrogation methods that bordered on the inhuman. The first traces appear in an OSS memorandum dated July 1945, listing priority scientists for technical transfer. Among the well-known rocketeers, several names are followed by an unusual designation, BW. In later versions of the list, those names vanish altogether, replaced by blank spaces. Cross-referencing Army custody rosters shows that at least 7 of these individuals were captured and processed at camps in Bavaria, only to disappear before their official transfer to Fort Detrick. One of them, Dr. Emil H., had been a physician at Dachau, accused of overseeing hypothermia experiments. His indictment at Nuremberg was inexplicably dropped in late 1946. Internal. Correspondence suggests he was retained under special conditions. Chemical. Warfare files from the same period corroborate this. A US Army report marked Restricted 1947 refers to German-developed incapacitating agents, stable under field conditions. The description matches notes recovered from laboratories at Dyhern Firth, where the Germans had tested nerve agents and hallucinogens, yet instead of being destroyed, samples were catalogued and shipped to Maryland. Project staff at Fort Detrick later admitted under oath that they had foreign consultants assist in trials between 1947 and 1951. No names were recorded. The Ordnance Department insisted these were defensive studies, but the language of the reports betrays a different intent. Controlled derangement protocols, long-duration compliance states. These phrases echo those found in surviving Blackwing papers, suggesting a direct line from Reich laboratories to American black sites. The secrecy surrounding the Black Wing was unlike that of mainstream Paperclip. While von Braun and his team were publicly sanitized, their Nazi affiliations obscured but not erased. The Black Wing scientists were erased entirely. Their service records were burned, their SS ranks deleted, their very identities reconstructed. When congressional inquiries into Paperclip surfaced in the late 1950s, no trace of them appeared. Yet scattered references betray their existence. A 1952 CIA cable mentions results from BW intake, now applicable to Bluebird channels. Bluebird was the forerunner of MKultra, the CIA's notorious mind control program. The implication is clear. Data from the Blackwing directly fed into early CIA psychological experiments. Witnesses add flesh to the file fragments. A former Army intelligence officer, speaking anonymously in 1977, recalled being ordered to escort 2 technical specialists from Bavaria to a classified facility outside Frankfurt. They spoke little English, he remembered, but they carried boxes of documents with red markings. One of them wore civilian clothes that still bore faint outlines where SS insignia had been cut away. When the officer asked who they were, his superior replied only, "You didn't see them. They are Blackwing." Survivors of Dachau and Ravensbrück testified after the war about experiments involving chemical injections, sensory manipulation, and sleep deprivation. Their statements were entered into the record at Nuremberg but never pursued, the perpetrators' names mysteriously absent from indictments. Some researchers believe those names were deliberately removed because the individuals were already in American custody. One chilling account from a Polish survivor describes a doctor promising her that the Americans will find this useful. The phrase lingered in her testimony, unremarked upon by prosecutors, but in hindsight it takes on new meaning. By 1949, the Cold War was escalating, and justification for secrecy grew stronger. A Defense Department memo from that year, declassified in 2002, notes, "Certain personnel retained under Paperclip conditions remain unsuitable for exposure due to nature of prior activities. Their expertise has direct bearing on counter-Soviet interrogation." This euphemism suggests the Blackwing's involvement in psychological warfare planning. Indeed, the CIA's later experiments with LSD, sensory isolation, and coercive interrogation mirror techniques first described in surviving German wartime documents. What became of the Blackwing scientists is a matter of conjecture. Some may have been absorbed into Fort Detrick's chemical division, others into CIA safe sites in occupied Germany. A few may have been given new identities and relocated within the United States under military protection. None appear in immigration records, yet budget ledgers from 1947 to 1950 show unexplained disbursements to foreign consultants under Army Chemical Corps projects. Even more unsettling are reports from former detainees of the CIA's earliest black sites, who describe German-speaking interrogators present during sessions. The moral implications were buried beneath the rhetoric of national security. To admit the Blackwing's existence would have meant acknowledging that America not only forgave, but actively employed men responsible for war crimes in the name of Cold War advantage. Thus the files were sealed, the names erased, the evidence folded into other programs. When Paperclip was finally exposed in the 1970s, the focus remained on rockets and space travel. The darker story, of men whose skills lay not in engineering but in breaking the human mind, remained buried. Occasional fragments surface. A heavily redacted CIA document from 1963 refers to early European protocols from WWII. A German parliamentary inquiry in 1998 uncovered references to missing Dachau medical records last seen in American custody. In 2005, a historian examining Fort Detrick's archives stumbled upon a folder labeled BW Transit, containing only a single page with typed instructions. Destroy upon review. The page was unsigned. The Blackwing's legacy persists not in monuments or museums, but in the silence that surrounds it. It exists in the gaps between documents, in the testimonies cut short, in the names missing from trial records. It exists in the uncanny similarity between wartime experiments and Cold War programs officially born years later. The absence itself becomes evidence, a shadow cast across the archival record. For the families of those erased, no closure exists. For the victims of the experiments, justice was denied. And for historians, the truth lies scattered across redacted pages and misfiled boxes. Enough to hint, but never to confirm. The sanitized history of Operation Paperclip tells us of rockets that reached the moon. Its black wing, buried in silence, reminds us that some knowledge was bought not with scientific progress, but with human suffering carefully concealed. In the end, the story of the Black Wing is less about what was achieved than about what was hidden. Names struck out, files burned, truths orphaned in service of a new war that demanded forgetting the old. Even in the ruins of empires and the ashes of battlefields, there remain doors left unopened, rooms left unlit, and files deliberately consigned to oblivion. What was taken, erased, or hidden has not vanished. It waits, buried like embers under stone, capable of igniting if unearthed. These stories are fragments of a deeper labyrinth, where absence itself is evidence, and where every sealed archive suggests not closure, but concealment. To walk away from these shadows is to wonder what still lies beneath the ground we take for solid. What whispers echo through corridors no one dares map? What truths smolder just beyond reach? For every war that ends in surrender, another begins in silence, and the silence is far more difficult to end. In that silence, secrets are not forgotten. They are merely waiting for someone to open the wrong file.